In 1645, the magistrates of Edinburgh ordered that several winds off the high street should be shut up at both ends and watched day and night until the infection within them should cease. Start with the plague, because in Edinburgh the story of what lies sealed beneath the present city begins with what the town council did when. Contagion took hold, and because the way that story has been retold since, then carries within it the distortion that makes the real burial. More difficult to see. The council minutes from August of 1644 record the arrival of plague in the Canongate and the Leithwind and the measures taken to isolate houses where deaths had occurred. And those measures were not unusual for a Scottish burgh of that period, which relied on containment and quarantine and the appointment of bailies to enforce closure. The men who carried out the orders were not soldiers, but masons and glovers and fellow burgesses who stacked timber barriers and mortared stone across entries that a week earlier had been open thoroughfares. Food was left at the walls, and the dead were removed at night by men called foul clangers who wore waxed coats, and the living who remained inside waited without knowing whether the exterior watch would hold or whether the sickness would pass through the clothes despite the sealing. What survived in the Civic Archive is procedural. A list of expenditures for lime and for watchmen and for the cleansing of houses with smoke and vinegar. And that procedural quality makes the legend of live entombment both understandable and unsupported, because a record which documents the cost of a new padlock will usually also document the expenditure required to dig graves. If you walk the Royal Mile today, you know the feeling of the ground falling away on both sides. To the north the slope drops toward what was once the Nor Loch and is now Prince's Street Gardens. To the south it falls toward the Cowgate and the steep rise of the Old Town beyond. You stand on a spine of rock, and you are conscious that the buildings on either side are not only tall, but layered, that their gables record additions and collapses and additions again. The close which has given this whole underground a name was not a single close at all. Mary King's Close was a warren of tenements and courtyards off the High Street, which took its name from Mary King, a burgess's daughter who traded in fabrics, and who with her second husband Thomas Nimmo held property there in the 1630s, and whose name appears in testamentary documents proved before the Commissary Court of Edinburgh. The Close and its neighbours, Stewart's Close and Pearson's Close and Allen's Close and Craig's Close, formed a dense urban block, whose ground floors opened onto the High Street market, and whose backlands descended 7 stories to the Nor Loch, and whose walls still carry the smoke blackening of centuries of peats and coal fires. When the Royal Exchange was built between 1753 and 1761 to provide a mercantile hall for the city after a design promoted by Lord Provost George Drummond, the council did not demolish the closes on the north side of the High Street entirely, but instead used their masonry as foundations and buried their upper stories to form a level platform, and in doing so preserved rooms and alleys and midden deposits precisely because it sealed them from daylight and weather. If you are listening to this late at night, consider leaving a note in the comments about where you are hearing it from and what time it is where you are. These histories collect best when they are carried in quiet, and it helps to know whose quiet they are entering. Then return to the close itself, because the ground there keeps more than stories. Start with scale, because Edinburgh teaches the eye to underestimate what lies under its surface. The old town occupies a ridge less than a kilometre long and scarcely 200 metres wide at its broadest point. Yet within that footprint, the Ordnance Survey and the records of Historic Environment Scotland and the City of Edinburgh Council Archaeology Service list more than 200 individual subterranean voids with formal site numbers. And those are only the voids which have been surveyed, given a reference, and entered into the Sites and Monuments record. There are the 17 closes or parts of closes preserved beneath the city chambers on the Royal Exchange, each with between 4 and 12 discrete spaces, and there are the 19 arches of the South Bridge, with vaults on both sides which when originally constructed comprised around 120 chambers on 2 levels. And there are the separate complexes at Blair Street and Nidri Street and Cowgate and Guthrie Street, and then there is Gilmerton Cove to the south of the city, which is a different order of thing entirely. Not the Shire, not the Lothians, the core medieval burg alone. The chronology matters because the sealing was not a single event 350 years ago, but a series of events which accumulated across 2 centuries and which the shorthand of a single date can only misrepresent. The first major act of institutional burial occurred in the late 1640s when plague regulations closed portions of the High Street backlands. Although the documentary evidence suggests these closures were temporary and used timber and controlled access rather than permanent masonry, and the physical evidence recovered from Mary King's Close does not support a single catastrophic sealing at mid-century. The second and more decisive act came between 1753 and 1761 with the construction of the Royal Exchange, when the city laid a platform across the slope and created what builders at the time called the low and dark streets beneath the new building. The third and largest act came in 1785 to 1788, with the construction of the South Bridge by engineer Robert Kay and contractor James Brown, who promised the town council a bridge that would connect the old town to the new university buildings and to the growing southern suburbs over the deep and fetid trough of the Cowgate. The fourth act came gradually across the 19th century as the closes which remained open were floored over or truncated or incorporated into sanitary reforms after the cholera outbreaks of 1832 and 1848. So what a visitor encounters now is not one sealed city, but several sealed quarters built at different times for different reasons and using different techniques of burial. There is over 1 kilometre of accessible vaulting in the South Bridge system alone, if you include the passages which are structurally stable but closed to the public, and perhaps 3 kilometres of mapped passage and chamber across the old town closes when cellars and intramural stairs and garderobe chutes and later service tunnels are included. The work of surveyors like Norrie Rowan, who entered the sealed vaults in 1985 after discovering a doorway behind a wall in a Blair Street pub cellar, and like archaeologist Richard Coleman of AOC Archaeology, who directed excavations for the city chambers in 2002 to 2003 before conservation, gave numbers to spaces that earlier maps had shown as hatched voids. Their measured plans show walls of Craiglithe sandstone and bedded rubble bonded with lime mortar containing charcoal flecks, flag floors worn concave by feet, hearths set at angles that do not align with the present street grid because they align with a different street grid entirely. If you descend the stone stair that now provides access from the Royal Mile, you feel the temperature change first. The air cools by 4 or 5 degrees within a few metres, and the sound of the high street narrows to a filtered murmur. You are aware of weight above you, of several stories of stone, and of the persistence of older domestic order within that weight. The record of who used these spaces is less complete than the record of the spaces themselves, and that incompleteness is itself part of the evidence. The Burgess Rolls record owners and the hearth tax rolls of 1690 to 1691 record chimneys, and the Stent Rolls record rental values. But the succession of subtenants who occupied a single chamber in a close during a decade, when the population of the burg rose above 35,000 within a walled area of barely 50 acres, often left no written trace. The sealing preserved objects that the written record did not, and for that reason the archaeology beneath the Royal Mile has attracted sustained attention from the University of Edinburgh and from the National Museums of Scotland, and from independent analysts working on ceramic and leather and animal bone, all of whom have approached the deposits not as curiosities, but as assemblages which can speak to consumption and waste and construction and disease with a precision that written sources alone cannot supply. Start with the rock, because in Edinburgh, the rock dictates everything that followed. The city sits on ground which has been worked and reworked by fire and by ice and by human quarrying, and the shape that results is a crag and tail, a geological form in which a hard mass of igneous rock protects softer sediments in its lee from the full scouring force of a moving ice sheet. The crag is Castle Rock, a dolerite plug which formed in the throat of a carboniferous volcano some 340 million years ago, when Scotland lay near the equator and when ash and basalt were erupting across what would become the Midland Valley, and whose dolerite resists weathering far more effectively than the sandstones around it. The tail is the ridge that extends eastward from that plug, composed of mixed sediments and debris which the last major glaciation, the Midlandian or Daventian glaciation, which reached its maximum extent around 27,000 years ago and retreated from the Edinburgh area roughly 15,000 years ago, streamlined into a gentle slope. On that slope a medieval town could be laid out with a single main street along its crest, and with burgage plots extending downslope to defensive perimeters, and because the rock was hard at the top and soft and unstable down the sides, the town was forced to grow vertically rather than laterally once its walls were fixed. The Norloch is essential to the story, because the ceiling beneath the Royal Exchange cannot be understood without understanding the loch that lay immediately below it. The loch occupied a natural depression scoured by ice between the castle ridge to the south and the hill now crowned by Princes Street to the north, and it was in origin a marshy hollow fed by the springs that still run under the new town, and it appears on maps as early as the 15th century as a body of water used for defence and later for milling. By the late 16th century the Burgh Council had allowed it to receive much of the town's sewage and butchery waste and tanning effluent, and by the mid-17th century contemporaries described it as an open cesspool whose smell carried as far as Leith on southerly winds. The closes which descended from the High Street to the loch did so through deposits of night soil and ash and butchered bone that had accumulated for generations, and the men who cleaned the streets, known as the Baxters of the Muck, carted waste to designated lay stalls, but never in quantities sufficient to prevent the accumulation of a dark organic stratum that archaeologists now call urban dark earth, and which in places is more than 3 metres deep. When the Royal Exchange was proposed, Lord Provost George Drummond argued that levelling the slope and burying the northern heads of the closes would achieve 2 things at once, namely creating a dignified mercantile square and removing houses which the council now considered irredeemably insanitary. And the council minutes of 1752 frame the decision in the language of improvement and commerce and public order, rather than of commemoration or preservation. Royal burgh status had been conferred by David I in the early 12th century, traditionally dated to 1124, although the earliest surviving charter references later, and that status brought the right to hold a market and to levy customs and to restrict trade within its liberty, and with those rights came an obligation to maintain a defensible perimeter. The burgage plots which were laid out on either side of the High Street were long and narrow by design, each giving a burgess a frontage on the market street and space behind for workshops and gardens, and later for tenements, and the boundary between one burgage and another was marked by a close or wynd which provided access from the street to the backlands. Over time the pressure of population, which rose from perhaps 2,000 at the end of the 12th century to perhaps 10,000 by 1560, and perhaps 30,000 by 1640 according to estimates compiled by historian Michael Lynch of the University of Edinburgh, and based on baptismal and customs records forced those burgage plots to be subdivided and built upon more densely, and to achieve that density the timber-framed houses of the 13th century were replaced by stone tenements of 6 or 7, or in some cases 10 stories, which contemporaries described as lands. Daniel Defoe visited in 1725 and wrote that the houses in the High Street were the tallest he had seen in Britain, and that the closes descending from them were so narrow and deep that daylight scarcely reached their lowest windows even at midsummer. The manorial survey conducted by James Gordon of Rothiemay in 1647, known as Gordon's Map, shows the burg as a herringbone of narrow closes descending from a broad spine, a pattern which remained legible despite fire and rebuilding for another century. Building technology mattered because it dictated how much of the medieval town could survive when later structures were placed above it. Edinburgh builders used rubble sandstone walls bedded in lime mortar, often with timber floor joists set into sockets, and they frequently reused foundations rather than digging new ones, and they built gable to gable in a way that distributed load onto shared walls, and that construction meant that when the Royal Exchange builders cut a platform, they could leave the lower portions of earlier walls in place as retaining structures and pack them with clay and demolition rubble rather than carting them away. Archaeologist K.R. Lindsay mapped these relationships in the 1960s while working for the city engineer, and his unpublished plans, which are held in the city archives, show how a 16th century wall might serve as footing for a 17th century wall, which in turn served as footing for an 18th century arch, so that the stratigraphy is as vertical as it is horizontal. The geologist Charles Lyell visited Edinburgh in the 1830s and noted that the city displayed a kind of unconformity not only in its rocks, but in its building fabric, a term he borrowed from geology to describe a surface where older rocks are truncated by younger deposits. And that metaphor captures the physical relationship between the Royal Exchange platform and the closes beneath it with precision. If you pause where the old close wall meets the 18th century vault, you can see the change in stonework with your own eyes. Below, the stone is smaller and more irregular, and the mortar is thick and pale with crushed shell. Above, the blocks are squared and coursed, and the joints are tight, and a different quarry. Public health is the other deep background which must be understood, because sealing is sometimes presented as accidental preservation, and sometimes it was that, but sometimes it was intentional sanitary management with preservation as an unintended consequence. Plague visited Edinburgh in 1498 and 1514, and 1530 and 1568, and 1585, and 1597 and 1604, and 1644 to 1645, and on many lesser occasions. And on each occasion the council responded with measures which combined exclusion and cleansing, the burning of bedding and the washing of houses with chloride of lime, and the designation of muirland burial grounds outside the walls. The 1644-45 epidemic was the most extensively documented, with physician and later diarist John Laying noting mortality across the parishes, and with the council ordaining that infected houses be closed and marked with a white cloth, and that bearers carry corpses to Greyfriars kirkyard by night to avoid panic. That the council closed houses is certain. That it walled people inside houses while alive and left them to die is not documented in the council minutes, although the minutes do document a fine imposed on a watchman who abandoned his post at a sealed house near the Nether Bow, which suggests that watch was maintained, and that quittance, the formal release from quarantine after 40 days, was at least procedurally expected. Norloch was drained in phases between 1760 and 1820 under engineer James Jardine, whose proposals turned a polluted loch into the gardens and then the principality of the new town, and that draining changed the hydrology of the closes above it, because water which had once seeped laterally through midden now had to flow through culverts and sewers. The South Bridge was conceived as part of the same improvement programme, and its architect Robert Kay designed it not as a single span, but as a series of arches which carried the roadway over the Cowgate Gorge while enclosing vaults on either side which could be rented as workshops and storage for merchants who needed space near the high street but could not afford high street rents. The council approved the use of vaults as commercial premises in 1788 and let them on 19-year leases, and the leases which survive in the national records of Scotland show shoemakers and fleshers and vintners and ironmongers as early tenants, which establishes that the spaces were considered valuable and not inherently unfit for occupation at their inception. Start with Mary King herself, because the name has become shorthand for a sealed underworld, and the woman who bore it has been largely displaced by the shorthand. Mary King was the daughter of Burgess Alexander King, an advocate who appears in the Edinburgh Burr records from 1595, and she married first Thomas Nimmo, a merchant, by whom she had at least 4 children, and second James Corse, who was also a merchant, and she traded in cloth and held property on the south side of what became Mary King's Close and the north side of what became Allen's Close. Testament dated for her son Alexander King, who died in 1644, inventories goods, including Holland cloth and English serge, and lists debts owing to and by the family which placed them firmly in the middling mercantile stratum of the burgh, not among the poorest residents whose housing has attracted the legend, but among owners who rented portions of tenements to subtenants. That a woman held burgh property and traded in her own name was not unusual in Edinburgh after the reforms of the early 17th century, which permitted widows and wives to continue businesses, and the council registers contain multiple references to women traders fined for forestalling or rewarded for providing cloth for civic livery. So Mary King was legally and socially legible in a way that later romantic accounts which cast her as a marginal figure have obscured. The close itself comprised at least 3 major phases of building before its burial. The earliest phase identified by Richard Coleman in the 2002 excavation for the City of Edinburgh Council and Historic Scotland, now Historic Environment Scotland, consisted of fragmentary walls of early 14th century date recovered in Trench Mistook O2, possibly related to the initial stone building that followed the Wars of Independence, when Edward I had slighted the castle and the burgh was re-established. The second phase, dating to the late 16th and early 17th centuries, comprised tall tenement lands which fronted High Street and which incorporated turnpike stairs and timber galleries and fireplaces with moulded jambs, examples of which survive in the close known as Mary King's Close as preserved, and whose inventory of fittings includes iron-yet doors and box beds. The third phase belongs to the period of subdivision after about 1630, when large merchant houses were divided into smaller lodgings, and when internal partitions of stud and clay were inserted, and when garderobe shafts were blocked and repurposed as storage, and this phase corresponds to the densification which contemporaries complained produced darkness and stench. The artefacts recovered reflect this sequence, with sherds of imported German stoneware and French pottery from the 16th century, and mid-17th century clay pipes with small bowls, and later 18th century creamware and pearlware in the demolition fill, which sealed the rooms during Royal Exchange construction. If you stand in the room which is now called Mary King's Room, you are aware that you are several metres below the present High Street pavement, and that the daylight which enters now enters through electric systems designed to imitate candlelight. The ceiling is low, and the wall contains a blocked fireplace where a mural crown moulding has been left in place, and the floor shows patches of stone slabs which were laid at different times. The decision to build the Royal Exchange was taken by the council in 1752 after years of complaint that Edinburgh lacked an enclosed mercantile exchange comparable to London and Glasgow, and that merchants were forced to conduct business in the open street. And Lord Provost George Drummond, who had driven the foundation of the Royal Infirmary in 1729, and who was committed to a programme of urban improvement partly modelled on contemporary proposals in London after the publication of John Strype's survey, promoted the scheme with letters to landed subscribers and to the Convention of Royal Burghs. The architects John Adam and John Fergus prepared competing plans, and Adam's plan, which retained open courts, was preferred in principle, although economic constraints forced modifications, and the council borrowed £15,000 from the Royal Bank of Scotland and raised subscriptions from burgesses to finance the works. To create a level platform for the exchange, contractor John Jaffray was instructed to demolish the tenements north of the High Street down to first floor level and to infill the voids with rubble and clay, leaving lower stories accessible only from the sides. The infill contained demolition rubble with oyster shell mortar still adhering, and fragments of Delft tile and clay pipe stems and late medieval pottery redeposited out of context, indicating that the builders simply pushed standing walls over into the closes and levelled the mass before laying foundations. Shards of this type were catalogued by city archaeologist John Lawson, whose team recorded over 4,000 pottery sherds and 1,000 clay pipe fragments from the infill during watching briefs between 1999 and 2006. That the closes continued to be accessed after partial burial is demonstrated by late 18th century and early 19th century artefacts found at floor level beneath later collapse, including bottle glass of circa 1790 to 1810, and a bone domino and leather shoe soles with hobnails which postdate the supposed ceiling by decades. Rate books for St Giles Parish from 1770 to 1790 list inhabitants of Stewart's Close and Kinghorn's Close, with occupations such as sawyer and coppersmith and vintner, and an entry for Mrs. White, widow, who maintained a lodging for 8 persons in a space which cartographic evidence suggests was already partly under the exchange platform, and that suggests not a single sealed city, but a gradient of light and access which diminished as the platform settled, and as property owners walled off portions which had become damp and unprofitable. The excavation by AOC Archaeology recorded joist holes which had been recut to insert lower ceilings to counter damp, and plaster layers which show repeated whitewashing, a technique used to improve light and perceived cleanliness, and both indicate attempts to continue habitation despite worsening conditions. If you crouch at the low doorway that connects 2 chambers, you notice how the threshold has been cut down twice, each cut leaving a distinct tool mark, because successive floors were laid higher to counter rising damp from the underlying midden. The narratives that grew after burial drew on 2 separate reservoirs, namely plague memory and class anxiety. The chronicler Robert Chambers, whose Traditions of Edinburgh published in 1824, collected oral histories from elderly residents who remembered the closes before sanitary clearance, recorded a story that plague victims in Mary King's Close had been sealed up and left to perish, and he attributed the story to an old woman named Mrs. C, who claimed descent from a resident. Chambers himself was cautious and noted that the story might be a distortion of the routine closure of infected houses, but later compilers including anthologists of haunted Scotland repeated it without his caution, and by the late 19th century guidebooks offered the close as a site of pestilential martyrdom. The town council's sanitary reports of 1865 to 1870, compiled by Dr. Henry Duncan Littlejohn, who was appointed the first medical officer of health for Edinburgh in 1862, and whose work on intramural burials and close inspection remains foundational for urban public health history, describe the remaining open closes north of the High Street as still occupied and still in sanitary, but do not describe sealed chambers with corpses inside. And Littlejohn's survey maps show inhabited rooms above the buried levels, which suggests continuity of ownership and access rather than mass entombment. The closure as archaeological act has left traces which are as legible as the documentary record. The builders of the Royal Exchange inserted relieving arches over earlier walls, left drawer holes for scaffolding, and dumped hot lime mortar which carbonised adjacent timbers, and those traces allow a trained eye to distinguish phases, and that is why the team from the University of Edinburgh Department of Archaeology under Dr. Alex Hale argued in 2008 that the close should be interpreted not as a snapshot of plague burial, but as a palimpsest of 600 years of urban living preserved because burial was piecemeal and structural. Hale's argument drew on thin section analysis of mortars, which identified up to 7 distinct mixes, and on dendrochronology of 2 oak lintels, which gave felling dates of 1574 and 1612. Proving that elements of the timber frame predated the supposed mid-17th century ceiling by decades, and that occupation continued after it. Palimpsest is the term archaeologists use for a deposit in which multiple periods are superimposed and partially truncated, and Mary King's Close is a type example because its preservation required partial destruction, namely the removal of upper floors to create fill which protected lower floors. You move from a chamber where a bed recess is still visible to a narrow wind where the sky was once visible as a slit, and where now electric light picks out the underside of 18th century arches. Start with the bridge, because the bridge is the reason the vaults exist, and the reason they were forgotten. In 1785 the town council, still animated by the improvement programme which had produced the New Town and the North Bridge in 1772 and the Royal Exchange 3 decades earlier, approved a plan to link the High Street with the southern suburbs over the steep and narrow valley of the Cowgate, where refuse from the old town accumulated and where the present street level was already several metres above the medieval ground because of centuries of muck and debris. The engineer was Robert Kay, mason and surveyor to the city, and the contractor was James Brown, who agreed to build the bridge for £7,000, although the actual cost exceeded £10,000, and forced the council to allocate few duties from the South Bridge feuars to meet interest. The design called for 19 arches of varying span, the largest over the Cowgate itself being 31 feet wide, and for buildings of 3 and 4 stories to line the bridge on both sides, their lower stories forming vaulted chambers that would extend to the Cowgate level and whose floors would be level with the Cowgate street, and whose upper floors would be level with the bridge roadway. Rental of those chambers was envisaged from the outset as revenue to service debt, and the council printed advertisements in the Edinburgh Advertiser offering warehouses and cellars with dryness and security, guaranteed by stone vaulting and iron doors. The promise of dryness was not met, because the contractor used construction methods that favoured speed and economy over damp proofing, and because the ground behind the vaults retained water from the slope, and because the builders omitted adequate flashing and through ventilation. Stone was quarried from Craigleith and from Ravelston and carted through closes already overburdened with traffic, and timber centering was erected for each arch and removed once keystones were set. and the pockets behind the vault crowns were filled not with clean stone, but with mixed rubble including clay and organic matter excavated from the Cowgate Trench, which retained water and slowly released it into the interior. Examination by structural engineer John Addison in 1995, commissioned after the Cowgate fire of 2002, although prepared earlier for the Building Control Office, identified extensive rot in embedded timber lintels and salt crystallization in lower courses, both diagnostic of long-standing damp, and mortar analysis showed high levels of nitrates consistent with organic waste percolating from above. Tenants began complaining within a year of occupation that goods stored in the lower vaults became mildewed and that the smell of rot permeated even the bridge-level shops. The leases show how occupancy shifted as damp and darkness discouraged legitimate trade. The earliest leases from 1788 to 1795 record vintners and ironmongers and drapers, merchants who required proximity to the high street markets and who could afford to whitewash walls and lay wooden flooring to counter damp, and who typically held 2 or 3 chambers. By 1800 to 1810, the rate books and the Edinburgh Post Office Directory show a change to artisans and makers, shoemakers and tailors and slaters and coppersmiths, and by 1815 to 1825, the occupants included a higher proportion of lodging houses and shebeens, illicit alehouses selling spirits without licence, and brokers of second-hand goods. The census of 1841 and 1851, transcribed by researchers at the University of Edinburgh School of Social and Political Science for the Digitising Scotland project, shows families of 6 or 8 persons living in a single vault chamber, often with occupations listed as hawker or labourer, and infant mortality in these returns appears elevated relative to the Canongate and Newtown returns, although interpretation is complicated by under-registration. If you step into Vault 4, as it is now labelled, you are aware first of the arch above you, and then of the damp line on the wall, which even after conservation shows where water stood for decades. The stone is cool, and the sound of the Cowgate traffic reaches you as vibration rather than noise. The association with crime and with body snatching is real, but must be proportioned, because the South Bridge vaults became entangled with a set of events that occurred nearby rather than within them, and because subsequent retelling has condensed geography. William Burke and William Hare committed their murders in 1827 and 1828 in houses in Tanner's Close off Westport, some 400 metres west of the South Bridge, and delivered corpses to the anatomy school of Dr. Robert Knox in Surgeons Square, which lay immediately south of the vaults. The proximity made the vaults a convenient setting for sensational stories, but the court testimonies transcribed in the High Court of Justiciary records. Volumes JC 26, 1828/111 and JC 26, 1828-330, held in National Records of Scotland, do not place any murder within the vaults, and the police plan of Knox's premises made after arrest shows access routes that avoided the bridge entirely. That the vaults housed persons engaged in criminal economy is well supported, and that they housed resurrectionists temporarily cannot be excluded, but conflation of every illicit act in the Cowgate into the vaults simplifies a more dispersed geography of poverty and exploitation which stretched from Grassmarket to Holyrood. Abandonment was gradual rather than sudden, and that gradualism explains why some vaults contain late material and others appear to have been cleared. The City Architects Department ordered inspections in 1860 to 1865 after a collapse of a portion of the bridge pavement, and reports note that vaults at the north end of the bridge were already unlettable because of noxious air, and that owners had blocked access to reduce liability. The sanitary department condemned several vaults as unfit for habitation in 1875 after an outbreak of typhus in the Cowgate, and subsequent Ordnance Survey maps of 1877 show some vaults labelled as void and others as still in use as stores for a spirit merchant. By 1900, the majority were used only for storage of coal and timber, and access from the Cowgate was limited by iron yet gates. And anecdotal accounts collected by Edinburgh writer and folklorist Stuart McHardy from elderly tradesmen in the 1970s record that apprentices were sent into vaults to retrieve timber and returned reporting local stories of voices and cold spots, which suggests that unofficial knowledge of the spaces persisted even after official leasing ceased. If you listen in the central vault, you notice how sound behaves. A whisper in one arch is carried along the curve and appears to come from elsewhere, and footsteps above on the bridge are audible as a distinct series of taps, separated by the span of the arches. Rediscovery belongs to a late 20th century moment, when Edinburgh's underground became a focus for both commercial and investigative attention. Norrie Rowan, a former Scotland international rugby player who after retirement ran a pub in Blair Street, noticed damp seeping through a cellar wall in 1985 and with his employee George Ferguson used a sledgehammer to open a partition and found behind it a stone-lined passage that led into vaults which had been inaccessible for perhaps 70 years. Rowan and Ferguson cleared rubble by hand over several months, recovering clay pipes and oyster shells and leather shoe fragments, and a collection of glass ink bottles which they displayed in the pub. And their work was later formalised by the City of Edinburgh Council, who commissioned a structural survey from engineers Thomas and Adamson, and a historical assessment from archaeologist David Pollock. The survey concluded that the vaults were generally stable but required repointing and improved drainage, and the assessment recommended that interpretation should distinguish between the original mercantile function and later slum occupation, a distinction which earlier tour narratives had blurred. Rowan's discovery triggered a series of similar openings by tenants on the north side of Cowgate, who found that their cellars connected to bridge vaults, and by 1995 a continuous passage could be traced from Blair Street to Niddry Street beneath the bridge, although sections remained flooded. The archaeology conducted after rediscovery was targeted rather than wholesale excavation, because the vaults are listed structures within the Edinburgh World Heritage Site, inscribed in 1995, and because conservation policy now favours preservation in situ over clearance. Where excavation occurred, for example in Vault 10 during works to install lighting in 1996 supervised by archaeologist Martin Cook of AOC Archaeology, deposits consisted primarily of laminated trampled floor layers of ash and organic matter less than 30 centimetres thick overlying bedrock or earlier midden, and the finds included 19th century transfer printed whiteware and bottle glass, and a notable concentration of shoe and boot leather, with over 100 leather fragments catalogued and conserved by conservator Margot Wright at the Scottish Conservation Studio. Analysis of the leather by Dr. Quita Mould, a specialist in archaeological leather, showed repair patterns and hobnailing consistent with heavy use by porters and carters, and suggested that cobbling and recycling of footwear was an economy of the vaults themselves rather than an import from elsewhere. Similarly, shoe last analysis by Dr. Tom Gardiner indicated children's sizes were present in proportions suggesting family occupation rather than solely adult male labour. Start with work, because the sealed streets are most easily imagined as places where people died during plague, and least easily imagined as places where people worked for generations before sealing made work impossible. The burg economy of early modern Edinburgh was organised around incorporated trades whose masters held privileges to produce and sell within the liberty. whose deacons sat on the council, and whose apprentices learned through service measured in years, and enforced through oath, and the closes descending from the high street were the physical plant in which much of that labour took place. Hammermen worked iron beside the fleshers who slaughtered cattle driven in from the Lothians on market days, and beside the cordoners who made shoes for burgesses and visitors, and beside the weavers who wove linen for domestic consumption and for export through Leith. And the noise and smell of those trades were part of why the council eventually considered the northern closes as problems to be. Solved through burial rather than through regulation, the Edinburgh tax rolls of 1635 and 1675, which are held in the National Records of Scotland under reference E69, list inhabitants by close, with assessments based on rent and on presumed stock, and show that while the high street frontages were assessed highest, the backlands contained multiple hearths each supporting a household and often a workshop, which means a single close might contain 10 or 12 economically independent units within a stone envelope barely 20 metres wide. Taverns and alehouses were particularly significant because they provided cooking facilities for tenants whose own rooms lacked hearths, deemed safe by the Dean of Guild, and because they provided heat in winter, and because they provided sociability in a burgh where church discipline monitored private behaviour but allowed licensed houses a degree of latitude. The diary of John Folis, an apothecary who recorded his drinking companions in 1681 to 1682, lists several taverns in King's Close and Stewart's Close where merchants met to discuss cargoes arriving at Leith. And the council minutes of 1702 record a complaint that tippling houses in the Winds remained open after the 10 o'clock bell, and that scholars from the town's college, now the University of Edinburgh, frequented them. When Richard Coleman excavated a tavern site in Merry King's Close, he recovered over 200 clay pipe bowls with makers' marks including those of Edinburgh pipe makers Thomas Banks and John Chapman, and concentrations of bottle glass and case bottles, and ceramic mugs of manganese mottled ware which are typical of early 18th century tavern assemblages in Scotland. And the density of such material near a hearth with a large lintel suggests not occasional drinking, but routine commercial service. If you stand in the small room interpreted as a tavern today, you can see where the bar would have run, and where the smoke from pipes blackened the ceiling. And you notice how low the ceiling is, and how the room would have filled quickly with warmth and conversation once its fire was lit. Shoemaking and leather repair dominated the later use of the South Bridge faults because leather work generated relatively little airborne vapour compared with tanning itself, which council regulations had long excluded from the intramural burgh because of its smell, and because slaughter waste from the Cowgate shambles provided a source of hides that could be processed nearby in tanners' clothes, and then cut and stitched in the vaults where rents were low. The Post Office Directory for Edinburgh 1803 lists 7 cordwainers and cordoners in the South Bridge and Blair Street area, and by 1823 listing 10, many with premises described as cellar or vault, and the 1841 Census Enumerators books show shoemakers living with apprentices in vault chambers, with beds arranged around lasts and cutting tables, which matches the archaeological recovery of leather offcuts concentrated near walls. The craft itself is visible in the surviving remains, an experimental reconstruction by archaeologist Dr. Jake Barrow at the Scottish Cranach Centre, using tools modelled on those found in the vault fill, has shown how a cordwainer could produce a pair of turn shoes in about 12 hours of work, and could resole a boot in 3, which implies a substantial economy of repair, serving the porters and carters and coal heavers who worked in the Old Town and could not afford new footwear except at hiring fares. Waste management is another facet of subterranean labour that is rarely acknowledged because its evidence is unpleasant, and because modern visitors prefer narratives of plague and haunting to narratives of night soil. Yet waste removal conditioned access to closes and vaults as much as any other factor. Until the mid-18th century, Edinburgh's closes were cleaned by a combination of private fossators, men employed to empty cesspits, and by the enforced labour of householders who were required by statute to bring their waste to the street on appointed days for carting to the Norloch or to designated middens outside the burg walls at Bristow and Potterrow. The minutes of the Dean of Guild Court from 1695 to 1710 contain repeated fines for failure to clean closes and for the illegal disposal of entrails within closes, and a petition of 1719 from inhabitants of Merry King's Close complains that the close was rendered impassable by dunghills, which suggests that urban dark earth accumulation was partly a failure of governance rather than an inevitable product of density. After the loch was drained, the construction of sewers under builders like William Milne, who engineered the early Newtown drainage and who surveyed the Old Town closes in 1770 for a proposed common sewer, gradually removed liquid waste but left solid accumulations in place because excavation was costly. And that solid accumulation forms the ground that sealed lower rooms when the Royal Exchange platform was laid. You smell the past in these places even now, not because scent has been preserved for 350 years, but because the stone itself holds moisture that once carried cess, and the air that moves through narrow voids still carries the cool humidity of saturated ground. Credit and debt also structured the subterranean economy, because Edinburgh was a burg where most transactions were conducted not in coin but in book credit recorded by merchants, and where a craftsman in a close might hold tallies against multiple suppliers and customers. Inventories taken after deaths, known as testaments testamenta and testament dative, survive in the commissary court records and often list debts owing to the deceased and goods pledged as security, and among those goods were tools and finished shoes and barrels of ale stored in vaults and cellars, which makes vaults not merely places of work, but collateral in a system of informal finance. The testament of Andrew Smith, shoemaker in Blair's Close proven in 1794, lists debts of £42 Scots owing from 12 persons and tools valued at £9, and specifies that the tools lie in the cellar below his lodging, which can be mapped onto the vault plan as a chamber with restricted access, and such specificity indicates that legal officers did enter vaults to value goods, which in turn indicates that vaults were considered orderly commercial premises at that date, rather than places beyond law. The winding down of that economy can be traced through declining valuations and through the shift from taxed hearths to untaxed temporary braziers, which the hearth tax returns and later the inhabited house duty assessments record indirectly because braziers were not counted. Excavation in Southbridge Vault 6 recovered a small cast iron brazier of 19th century type and surrounding concentrations of coal slack and cinder, indicating a fire maintained without a formal chimney, which would have produced severe smoke and carbon monoxide, and would have marked a descent from the earlier standard of living, where coal was burned in hearths with flues. Dr. Alison Brown of the University of Edinburgh, who has studied early modern fuel poverty in Scottish burghs using inventories and fuel prices, argued that the adoption of braziers in closes and vaults after 1800 reflects both fuel cost and landlord refusal to maintain flues in properties they considered temporary investments, and that such refusal accelerated abandonment because tenants could not legally claim habitation without adequate venting under police acts after 1833. The vaults became spaces where the formal economy of guilds and leases shaded into the informal economy of casual labour, and where sealing was as much a recognition of failure as an act of improvement. If you look at the ceiling, you see soot that is not uniform but clustered in plumes above where braziers stood, and you understand that each plume marks a season when someone attempted to keep working in cold and damp that had already defeated commerce. Start with the plague order because the most repeated account of Edinburgh's sealed city centres on the claim that magistrates in 1645 ordered closes to be walled up with living inhabitants inside and left them to die, and that this act explains the preservation of rooms containing skeletal remains and personal effects. And that claim requires careful assessment against both the documentary record and the physical evidence recovered since systematic excavation began. The documentary position is this. The Town Council minutes from September 1644 to February 1646, held at Edinburgh City Archives under reference SL1 24-27, and transcribed in extract by historian Marguerite Wood in her edition of extracts from the records of the Burgh of Edinburgh 1642 to 1655, record plague containment measures explicitly, including the appointment of bailies whose sole office was to oversee infected houses, the allocation of funds for supporting those confined within such houses, the designation of Johnstown's close and Bailey Fife's close and others as infected and to be closed, and the provision of watchmen to enforce closure and to prevent escape. The minutes for 15 September 1645 state that infected houses shall be closed up, and that their inhabitants shall not come forth without licence, and that victuals shall be brought to them and laid at a distance, and that those who have no provision shall be supplied at the town's charge, which language describes quarantine rather than live immurement. No minute orders masonry barriers sealing individuals inside to die without provision, and the associated treasurer's accounts list payments for timber and nails and for meat and ale delivered to closed houses, which is inconsistent with entombment without support. The burial registers for Greyfriars and for the Canongate record increased mortality, but also record names of persons who recovered after closure and who later appear in other records, which suggests that quarantined houses were regularly inspected and that survivors were released after a cleansing interval. The account that sealed plague victims were left to die appears in a later genre of writing, namely antiquarian compilations of the early 19th century which drew on oral tradition, collected several generations after the event. Robert Chambers in Traditions of Edinburgh 1825 edition cites a tradition that in Mary King's Close the magistrates sealed up houses and that persons within were left to their fate. Yet Chambers immediately qualifies that he received the story from an aged informant who was recounting family memory rather than documentary source, and that the story might have grown from the fact that houses closed by authority were marked and watched. Sir Walter Scott, whose own residence at Castle Street placed him within walking distance of the closes, and who wrote letters to Chambers about Old Town folklore, repeated the story with similar qualification, describing it as a tale told by old people. The work of Charles Creighton, whose History of Epidemics in Britain first published in 1891, collated parish mortality data and municipal responses, notes Edinburgh's 1645 outbreak, but does not confirm mass immurement, and instead emphasises the role of kirk sessions in providing relief to quarantined poor, whose minutes survive at the National Records of Scotland, under CH2. The physical evidence has been examined by multiple independent analysts whose conclusions converge. The excavations directed by Richard Coleman in 2002 to 2003 recorded no articulated human remains sealed within rooms beneath the Royal Exchange, and the disarticulated bone fragments recovered from Midden and infill consisted of butchered animal bone and a small number of isolated human bones redeposited from nearby kirkyards through graveyard soil used as levelling. a process documented in other Scottish burghs including St Andrews, where human remains were found in vault or close contexts. For example, a partial skeleton recovered during drainage work in Blair Street in 1986. Forensic analysis by Dr. Matthew Kershaw of the University of Dundee indicated post-mortem interval consistent with later intrusion rather than with mid-17th century plague, and subsequent dating of associated textile fragments placed the burial in the late 17th or early 18th century. Historic Environment Scotland commissioned a review of plague-related deposits in 2007 by Dr. Bennett Jewett, which concluded that while cesspits in Mary King's Close contained parasite ova consistent with crowded occupation, no mass burial of plague victims sealed within buildings had been demonstrated, and that rat bones recovered from relevant layers belonged to species Rattus norvegicus, which replaced Rattus rattus in Scotland after about 1700, which would postdate the 1645 epidemic. The persistence of the immurement narrative requires therefore an explanation other than corroboration, and that explanation lies partly in institutional practice and partly in economic reuse of story. When the Royal Exchange was built, some closes were indeed sealed by masonry in the sense that their upper portions were demolished and their entries blocked with stone to form a platform, and tenants who had not been compensated or who lacked alternative accommodation did experience forcible ejection rather than entombment, and those experiences generated resentment which could readily be projected onto an earlier and more dramatic episode of sealing. The council recognised this and offered few compensation to proprietors. But the compensation schedule recorded in SL1 shows sums of only a few pounds for houses whose rental values had been higher, and some small proprietors petitioned that they had been ruined, and those petitions were remembered by descendants. For tour operators in the late 20th century who reopened Mary King's Close and the South Bridge vaults to public visitation after decades of inaccessibility, a story involving plague victims sealed alive provided a clear emotional anchor and distinguished their offering from other historic properties, and economic incentives favoured retention of a dramatic account even after archaeological. Evidence questioned it. The responsible operators, including those accredited by the Scottish Tourist Guides Association and working with Historic Environment Scotland interpretation staff, now present the sealing as a product of improvement and the plague story as traditional rather than factual. Yet the older account continues to circulate because it answers a desire for deep moral drama that the more prosaic record of rented rooms and successive flooring does not satisfy. If you read the council minutes in the archive reading room, you notice how the clerk's hand becomes hurried in September 1645, with insertions and marginal addition, and you sense the pressure of mortality behind the procedural prose rather than any intention to commit atrocity. The complication, therefore, does not demolish the premise of a city sealed below the present one, but complicates its chronology and causation. There was sealing of streets by authority during plague, and there was sealing of closes by builders during improvement, and there was sealing of vaults by owners during abandonment, and each sealing belongs to a different century and a different logic. And the conflation of those sealings into a single event, dated roughly 350 years ago, simplifies a process that was cumulative. The real sealing expanded over about 110 years, from about 1645 to about 1761 for the closes beneath the exchange, and continued in stages for the South Bridge vaults from 1788 to perhaps 1875, which makes the idea of one lost city less accurate than the idea of several lost quarters overlapping in the same vertical space. That complexity does not make the underground less significant, it makes it more so, because it demonstrates how a medieval burg negotiated density and disease and commerce through piecemeal burial rather than through a single catastrophic preservation. And that negotiation is still legible in the walls for anyone who knows how to read mortar and recut doorways. You enter one chamber where a 17th century splayed window survives blocked with 18th century stone, and you understand that the city contains within itself the record of its own decisions, and that the record is architectural before it is legendary. Start with a person whose name survives because she sued, because litigation preserves lives that taxation and burial registers often omit. Isabel Stewart was a tenant in Stewart's Close, adjacent to Mary King's Close, and in 1687 she brought an action before the Dean of Guild Court complaining that her landlord had allowed the turnpike stair to fall into disrepair, and that water from the tenement above entered her lodging and spoiled her yarn. The court record, reference B48-9-128 in Edinburgh City Archives, records her as a spinner and as a widow maintaining 2 children, and records the court's order that the landlord repair the stair within 15 days under penalty of £5 Scots, which indicates that housing standards were enforced when tenants had the knowledge and resources to petition. That Isobel Stewart lived several stories below High Street level, that she worked with fibres which required relatively dry conditions, and that she contended with damp, which in retrospect we can connect to midden seepage, illustrates how intimately occupational viability and building maintenance were tied for those who occupied the lower closes, and her case is one of several dozen preserved close complaints from the period 1680 to 1710, which together show a subterranean population that was neither transient nor marginal, but engaged with civic mechanisms of redress. Alexander King, son of Mary King, offers another kind of visibility because he died in plague and his inventory survives, and because that inventory was made under. Circumstances of contagion which reveal procedure. The merchant Alexander King died in 1644, before the major epidemic year. His testament dative entered in 1645 records debts and credits, and includes a list of cloths held in his booth on the High Street and in his cellar, and includes a note that the appraisers entered his house wearing cloaks dipped in vinegar and carrying burning juniper because they feared infection, which detail appears in the inventory margin and is cited by historian Christine Dingwall, who has studied plague inventories. The list includes Holland valued at £18 and Frise at 12, and includes silver spoons, which suggests a household of modest comfort, and includes sums owing to him from persons in Fife and Linlithgow, indicating a trading network that extended beyond the burgh and that depended on the very close connections which plague severed. That his goods were appraised at all rather than burned indicates that even after death from plague, the burgh attempted to preserve property and to honour credit, which again complicates any notion of wholesale abandonment. He was buried in Greyfriars, his stone is not extant, but his name appears on the list of plague dead compiled by the Kirk Session and transcribed by Wood. Lord Provost George Drummond, born in 1688 and dying in 1766, was not a resident of the underground, but its principal barrier, and his motives require examination because they are recorded voluminously in pamphlets and council papers, and because they are often simplified in popular accounts as mere civic vanity. Drummond had seen London and had corresponded with English improvers about paving and lighting and about the economic benefits of enclosed exchanges, and his proposals invoked comparative improvement as a civic duty, and yet he also understood Edinburgh's insanitary condition from service as a commissioner of police, and from personal inspection of closes in 1750 when he reported to the council that the close below his own house was so foul that serving maids refused to enter it, His promotion of the Royal Exchange was therefore both emulation of metropolitan models and a pragmatic response to failing infrastructure, and his letters in the National Library of Scotland manuscript collection MS. 1742 show a man who ordered that displaced tenants be offered housing in the Canongate Mills, but who accepted that some would be displaced without compensation because council funds were insufficient. Drummond's second term as provost coincided with the foundation of the Royal Infirmary and with his involvement in the foundation of the university's medical school, and his broader medical philanthropy suggests a concern with public health that extended beyond Fard, which again makes the story of mercenary burial inadequate. If you read Drummond's letter of 29 October 1752, you encounter a hand that is decisive and impatient, with words underlined twice, and you sense a man who believed that stone could discipline behaviour. A different kind of human presence is Norrie Rowan, who on a winter afternoon in 1985 put a sledgehammer through a plasterboard partition in the cellar of his Blair Street pub and entered a space that had not been entered for decades. Rowan was born in 1951 and played rugby for Scotland 13 times at prop, and after retiring ran several public houses, and his discovery was not archaeological in intention, but entrepreneurial, because he needed storage and because cellar damp suggested a void behind the wall. With George Ferguson, he removed rubble by bucket, working evenings, recovering objects which they at first thought of as rubbish and only later as evidence, and Rowan kept a diary whose entries record progress in feet, and note collapses, and note water ingress, and note the smell, which he described as cold stone and mushrooms. Rowan's diary, excerpts of which were published in his memoir The Vaults of Edinburgh 2012, and which is held in copy by Edinburgh City Archives, reveals the ambivalence of rediscovery, because each chamber cleared made the pub's cellar larger and more useful but also more costly to maintain, and because the council threatened to close the premises until structural certification was obtained. His subsequent campaign to open the vaults to paying visitors was at times contentious, with archaeologists arguing that his clearance removed dating evidence, and with preservationists arguing that any access was better than continued sealing. And the dispute echoes an older pattern in Edinburgh, where improvement and discovery are rarely separated cleanly. You walk behind Norrie Rowan's original pub entry now, and you see brickwork which is modern, and a stone arch which is late 18th century, and you understand that the boundary between discovery and alteration is rarely sharp. Another obscure life recovered from the vaults belongs to a man named John Smith alias John Simpson, cordwainer, whose name appears on a leather scrap as a maker's mark stamped in the heel of a boot recovered from Vault 13, and who appears in the Post Office Directory of 1817 as John Smith, shoemaker, Blair Street Vault, and who disappears from directories after 1823, and whose boot is now held in the National Museum of Scotland collection H.NA 4123. That a bootmaker stamped his name indicates pride or at least commercial strategy, and that the boot found in a vault could be linked to a directory entry shows how artifact and document can be triangulated to produce a biography that would otherwise be invisible, and there are dozens of such links awaiting systematic study. The archaeological team, led by archaeologist Sue Mitchell, catalogued tool marks on lasts and cut patterns on uppers, and matched them to trade manuals such as The Art of Cordonnery, published in London in 1798, but known to have circulated in Edinburgh through the bookseller William White, whose shop records contain orders from Edinburgh makers. And that linkage allows a modest vault craft to be placed within a larger world of technical knowledge. If you hold such a boot in gloved hands, you notice the wear pattern on the sole, and you recognize a gate, a weight placed on the outer edge, which is unmistakably human. A final human presence to consider is the municipal archaeologist who must decide what remains sealed. John Lawson, who served as city archaeologist from 1990 to 2018, and who supervised watching briefs during the redevelopment of city chambers and the South Bridge, and who now works as a consultant, described in an interview with Dr. Chloe Rennard of the University of Edinburgh in 2019 the experience of watching a contractor prepare to pour concrete over a close that would be sealed again after, recording, and the sensation that something is being lost even when it is documented, because documentation is not habitation. Lawson's work established a policy that any new opening into sealed portions of the old town must be preceded by archaeological assessment, and that artefacts recovered must be reported to Treasure Trove Scotland, and his internal reports contain photographs of chambers that were recorded and then resealed because public access was not feasible, which means there remain spaces whose contents are known only from a few photographs and a context sheet. That act of resealing continues the historical pattern rather than breaking it, because sealing in Edinburgh has always been a management tool as much as a preservation accident, and the archaeologist who orders a void closed again after laser scanning participates in a continuity of decision-making that stretches back to George Drummond and beyond. You stand in a vault that has been scanned, and you see the tripod marks on the floor, and you understand that you are both documenting and burying again. Start with Gilmerton, because it tests the limits of what the term sealed city can mean. Gilmerton Cove, situated 4 miles south of the High Street in what was once a mining village on the edge of Gilmerton limestone, consists of a series of chambers and passages cut by hand into sandstone, comprising at least 7 chambers, a table, a fireplace, and a series of niches, and approached by a narrow entrance passage which was formerly covered. The tool marks visible on its walls include both narrow point marks consistent with pickwork and broader facets consistent with chisel finishing, and the chambers show evidence of secondary modification, including a doorway blocked with stone and a recess deepened for a later purpose. No primary documentary reference to its construction survives, and its first appearance on maps is in the late 18th century, when it was described as a curious cavity, although local tradition assigned it various uses, including as a refuge for Covenanters during the period of episcopal persecution in the 1670s and 1680s, and as a meeting place for Hellfire Club activity in the early 18th century, and as a blacksmith's forge. Archaeological recording by the Edinburgh Archaeological Field Society in 2000 to 2003, under the direction of archaeologist Barbara Morrow, together with survey by Historic Environment Scotland, concluded that the cove was most probably quarried initially for stone and subsequently adapted for habitation or craft use, with dating evidence including 18th century pottery and clay pipe stems in floor deposits, and with later graffiti dated 1765 and 1798 cut into chamber walls. The cove therefore presents a different chronology of sealing, namely a space that was opened rather than closed by design, and then left to decay and partially collapse, and then cleared and reinterpreted, and that sequence illustrates how subterranean narratives can accrue around spaces whose original function was purely practical. If you enter Gilmerton Cove from the street, you stoop immediately, and you feel the sandstone close around you, and you notice the temperature drop and the sound of traffic disappear within 3 steps. This variability cautions against treating all of Edinburgh's underground as a single category, because the closes beneath the Royal Exchange were street-front houses buried by formal improvement, and the South Bridge vaults were commercial premises which became slums through economic failure, and Gilmerton Cove was a rock-cut complex whose purpose changed with ownership. and the cellars of Leith were warehouses adapted to coal storage, and each retains a different kind of evidence and requires a different methodological approach. The methodology applied to the Royal Exchange closes emphasised stratigraphy and ceramic phasing and dendrochronology because those closes retained timber lintels and multi-phase walls, whereas the methodology applied to the South Bridge vaults emphasised architectural recording and social history and artefact conservation because those vaults retained floors but few primary walls, and the methodology applied to Gilmerton Cove emphasised petrography and toolmark analysis because that site retained rock surfaces rather than built masonry. The University of Edinburgh's Archaeology MSc programme used all three sites as training contexts in the 2010s, with students directed by Dr. John Lawson and Dr. Alison Crerar, conducting rapid earthworks survey and written scheme of investigation exercises. And those exercises produced archive reports which are now held in the Council's Historic Environment Record, and which demonstrate how professional standards must adapt to voids that are listed, occupied, flooded, or privately owned in varying combinations. Start with the sanitary surveys of the 19th century because they provide the clearest account of what the closes that remained open looked like on the eve of their final abandonment. Dr. Henry Duncan Littlejohn, appointed Medical Officer of Health in 1862 after completing a thesis on the intestinal pathology of fever at the University of Edinburgh, and after serving as a surgeon in the Royal Infirmary, was tasked by the Town Council with inspecting places where fever persisted and with recommending closure. And his reports collected as Report on the Sanitary Condition of Edinburgh in 1865 provide room descriptions of over 100 closes and winds, with measurements of cubic air space and observations on ventilation and on number of inhabitants. Littlejohn's surveyors measured closes with tapes and calculated occupancy rates and noted instances where a single room measuring 12 feet by 8 contained 5 persons sleeping on the floor, and where access to a privy was shared by 30 persons and was blocked, and where a window had been papered over because glass had broken and could not be afforded. And his language, although clinical, conveys the effective pressure of darkness and damp through cumulative detail rather than through moral judgment. He visited Stuart's Close and Anchor Close and Blackfriars Wynd, and noted that even closes partly under the Royal Exchange platform remained inhabited in their upper portions, while lower portions were used for storage of rags and bones, indicating that the gradient of use described for the 18th century persisted into the 19th, and that sealing was therefore never absolute, but always partial and negotiated. If you read Littlejohn's measurements, you are struck by how small the spaces were, and by how precisely he recorded them, and by how that precision itself was an attempt to impose order on conditions that resisted order. Littlejohn's recommendations led to acts of demolition which themselves created a second wave of sealing, because when insanitary closes were cleared under the Improvement Acts of 1867, promoted by Lord Provost William Chambers, brother of Robert Chambers the antiquarian, the council again levelled sites and buried basements to form new streets. Chambers Street, created between 1868 and 1871 as a direct outcome of Littlejohn's reports, and driven by architect Thomas Hamilton's successor architects David Cousin and John Lascelles, was laid across a series of medieval closes including North College Street and South College Street, and its construction involved demolition to 3 metres below High Street level and infill of lower cellars with rubble from demolition, a process recorded in photographs held by the Edinburgh City Archives which show labourers standing beside arches that had just been exposed and were about to be buried again. Those photographs show men in waistcoats and flat caps beside walls that display multiple phases of building and they show timbers projecting from walls. And they capture a moment that echoes the Royal Exchange platform construction a century earlier, when closure and exposure were simultaneous. The difference is that in the 1870s the infill was photographed, and its contents were sometimes recorded by antiquaries, including Thomas Ross of Macgibbon and Ross, the architectural historians who published The Castellated and Domestic Architecture of Scotland, and who sketched fragments of moulded stonework recovered from city improvements before those fragments were reburied or dispersed to. Museums. You walk Chambers Street now, and you are unaware that beneath its pavement lie cellars which were measured and photographed, and then sealed a second time within a century. The legal process of closure also preserved documents which illuminate how sealing was experienced by those displaced, because petitions for compensation survive in the town council minutes and in the records of the Court of Session where proprietors sued for better terms. The petition of James Anderson, Wright, tenant in Bailey Fife's Close, dated 1754, states that he held a lease of a workshop for 9 years, and that the council's appropriation for the exchange left him with 4 years unexpired and with tools and timber stock in place, and that he had been offered no alternative premises, and that he sought £20 Scots for loss, and the council response recorded in the margin offers 10. And Anderson's acceptance of that sum appears to have marked the end of his independent workshop, because he appears in later directories as journeyman rather than master. The petition of Elizabeth Cumming, widow tenant in Mary King's Close, dated 1760, states that she maintained herself by washing linen for students, and that her lodging under the new platform was rendered so damp that her washing would not dry, and that she was forced to move to the Canongate, and she too sought compensation for loss of custom, and her petition was deferred and then refused, which suggests how gendered and occupational vulnerability shaped the outcome of improvement. These petitions, studied by historian Doxtana Nenadic of the University of Edinburgh in her work on urban craft and credit, provide a small archive of displaced labour that is often absent from histories which celebrate improvement through architecture alone. If you trace those names into subsequent census, they often vanish or appear in poorer parishes, and you recognise a pattern of downward mobility that burial literally covered. The final thread in this expansion concerns materials, because materials are what survived, and because their analysis gives chronology and economy that documents cannot. Ceramic analysis by George Haggerty, whose work on Scottish pottery from East Lothian kilns and from Dutch imports forms the backbone of post-medieval ceramic dating in lowland Scotland, identified sherds of Westerwald stoneware with cobalt blue decoration from contexts beneath the Royal Exchange platform that date from 1680 to 1720, and sherds of Staffordshire white salt-glazed stoneware from 1720 to 1760, and sherds of creamware from 1760 to 1780, which together bracket the final occupation of the closes before platform sealing. Clay pipe analysis by Dr. David Higgins, who maintains the National Clay Pipe Register, dated pipe bowls from Mary King's Close as types 18 to 22 in Atkinson's typology, corresponding to 1660 to 1710, with maker's marks of Thomas Banks operating around 1695, which matches documentary occupation but does not match plague. Glass analysis identified bottle glass of the onion type typical of 1700 to 1720, and mallet type of 1720 to 1740, and cylinder type after 1740, showing continuity, and those categories are dated through stratified deposits at Edinburgh and at other Scottish burghs where glass production is documented. Dendrochronology of joists by Dr. Coralie Mills of the AOC Archaeology Dendrochronology Laboratory gave felling dates of 1573 and 1598 and 1610 for 3 lintels. indicating reuse of timber over long periods, which is typical of Scottish burgh construction, where oak was imported from the Baltic and pine from Scandinavia, and both were valuable. If you hold a sherd of Westerwald stoneware, you see the applied lion mask, and you understand that even in a close which descended to the Norloch, a householder acquired imported pottery. Start with documentation, because the amount of recording that now exists for Edinburgh's underground is itself a kind of second city made of paper and digital points. Laser scanning by Historic Environment Scotland's digital documentation team in 2015 to 2018, using a faro-focused scanner, captured over 12 billion points in Mary King's Close and in the South Bridge vaults, producing point clouds that can be sliced to show wall phases and that reveal details such as carpenter's marks on joists and mason's marks on quoins, which had not been visible in traditional hand-drawn surveys. Building archaeology as practiced by analysts such as Dr. Ingval Maxwell, former Director of Conservation at Historic Scotland, interprets such marks as signatures of labour organisation and as indicators of workshop practice. So a mark that a visitor dismisses as scratch becomes evidence of a building crew and its internal hierarchy. Photogrammetry by archaeologist Al Rollinson generated textured meshes of chamber interiors which allowed mortar analysis without scaffolding, and which showed colour differences between lime washes that correspond to phases of whitewashing noted in documentary accounts of attempts to improve lighting. In section analysis of mortars by Dr. John Hughes, who has published extensively on Scottish lime mortars, identified inclusions including coal ash and crushed brick and oyster shell, which distinguish 18th century improvement mortars from earlier medieval mortars, and which help date otherwise undiagnostic walls. All of these methods were applied because the underground offers limited opportunity for invasive excavation within a World Heritage Site, where preservation in situ is principle, and where any intervention requires scheduled monument consent. If you view the point cloud, you see the close rendered as a field of points, and you lose sense of solidity, and you understand the building as collection of decisions rather than as mass. The preservation conditions that made this documentation valuable also present conservation challenges that have no simple resolution, because sealing creates microclimates that are stable until disturbed and that become unstable after opening. Relative humidity measurements taken by conservators from the Scottish Conservation Studio over a year in vaults open to public tours show humidity fluctuating between 85 and 95% in winter and between 75 and 85% in summer, compared with 55 to 65% in rooms above the Royal Exchange platform that are heated and ventilated. And that difference drives salt cycles in masonry and corrosion in iron fittings, and mildew on leather and on wood. The decision to open Mary King's Close to tours required installation of passive ventilation ducts which draw air from the high street down through the closes and out through the cowgate, a system designed to reduce humidity while avoiding mechanical plant that would alter appearance. Yet monitoring shows that even with ventilation the lower chambers remain near saturation, and that organic. Materials left in situ decay more rapidly after opening than they did when sealed. This finding led to policy divergence between publicly interpreted chambers where decay is accepted as cost of access and chambers retained, as sealed research reserves where no tours enter and where humidity remains unmodified and where future analysts might recover better, preserved material than current technology permits. The existence of such reserves is not widely publicised because access to them is restricted and because their location is deemed sensitive, and that quiet reservation parallels the earlier 20th century situation, where knowledge of vaults persisted among tradesmen, but not officially, illustrating how institutional quiet can arise not from concealment intent, but from conservation pragmatism and liability management. You enter a chamber where sensors blink, and you hear fans that are designed to be inaudible, and you recognize that preservation now is active rather than accidental. The interpretive frameworks that guide public presentation have also shifted, moving away from narratives that privilege plague and supernatural explanation toward those that emphasize urban process and labour and public health. The script for the Real Merry King's Close Visitor experience, reviewed by historians from the University of Edinburgh Department of History in 2012, removed references to skeletal remains sealing and replaced them with references to documented business activity and with testimony from court records, and visitor surveys conducted by Continuum Attractions, which operates the attraction, indicated that visitor satisfaction did not decline after removal of dramatic plague claims, which suggests that audience appetite for depth exists when depth is offered with clarity. Similarly, interpretation in Mercat Tours, which operates in the South Bridge vaults, now distinguishes between strata of occupation and describes shoemaking and lodging house activity, and provides measurements of airspace. And that shift was influenced by input from archaeologists including Martin Cook, and from folklorists including Dr. Louise Milne, who argued that folklore and history can be presented as distinct layers rather than conflated. That professional negotiation of story and evidence reflects a broader trend in Scottish heritage interpretation, promoted by Historic Environment Scotland's Intangible Cultural Heritage Policy, which encourages presentation of oral tradition as tradition rather than as factual history, while acknowledging its cultural value, and which therefore allows the 1645 sealing legend to be told as a story told about the closes rather than as what happened within them. If you listen to a guide now, you will hear dates and names, and you will hear qualifications, and you will be trusted to hold uncertainty, and that trust itself is a form of respect. The comparative significance of Edinburgh's underground, therefore, lies not in uniqueness but in legibility, because many British towns have buried closes and vaults and cellars, but few have preserved them in such density and with such continuity of record, and few have integrated geological explanation and legal history and artefact analysis into a single narrative. The work of city archaeologist John Lawson, whose retirement in 2018 concluded a period of 28 years of continuous watching briefs, created an archive that includes over 400 context sheets for Mary King's Close alone, and over 300 for South Bridge vaults, together with specialist reports on ceramics and clay pipes, and leather and animal bone and metalwork and glass. And that archive is available to researchers through the City of Edinburgh Council and through Archaeology Data Service, making Edinburgh's buried quarters among the best documented urban subsurfaces in Northern Europe. That documentation now supports research questions that extend beyond local history, including questions about epidemiology and about fuel poverty and about building adaptation in response to climate, and about property law during periods of rapid urban change. And each of those questions draws on the underground not as curiosity, but as data set. The data set is fragmentary and biased toward material culture that preserves well in wet ash, and toward households that generated waste disproportionate to their number because they included workshops, and those biases must be named. Yet the fact that such questions can be asked at all derives from the accidental preservation generated by sealing and from the deliberate preservation generated by policy since the 1980s. You handle a context sheet, and you see sketches of a wall, and you see annotations about mortar, and you realise that the paper itself is now part of the site. Begin again with the ridge, because every return to Edinburgh's underground returns to topography. The crag that defends the castle from the west also prevents easy egress of water and waste to the north and south, and that prevention forced inhabitants of the closes to live above their own midden and to negotiate damp as a constant, and to raise floors and to recut doorways and to whitewash and to petition and finally to leave when negotiation failed. The platform that George Drummond laid across the northern closes in 1753 was presented as improvement and functioned as burial, and the bridge that Robert Kay constructed over the Cowgate in 1788 was presented as connection and functioned as enclosure of a different kind, and both reveal how infrastructure creates undergrounds even when its stated aim is to create surface. That process continues in the present with services trenching and with fibre optic ducts and with the construction of the Edinburgh Trams line, which exposed and then resealed small portions of earlier road surfaces, and which required archaeological recording under the same. Legislation. That now protects the vaults. The pattern is therefore not past but ongoing, a habit of city-making that buries its earlier attempts rather than erasing them entirely, and Edinburgh makes that habit visible, because its ridge compresses attempts vertically, and because its stone preserves them. If you descend to the closes now, you are descending through that habit, and you are aware that your entry itself will leave a trace in visitor counters and in humidity logs and in dust. Start with winter, because winter was when the closes were most difficult and therefore most revealing. Fuel price records from the Edinburgh coal market preserved in the Berg records show that coal price increased by 40% between October and February in typical years around 1700, and that increase fell hardest on tenants in lower closes whose hearths drew poorly, and whose rooms required more fuel to maintain minimal temperature. Inventories from testamentary records show that many households in Mary King's Close and adjacent closes owned only one blanket per person and a single iron pot, and that they stored peats rather than coal, because peats were cheaper, and that peat ash is less alkaline than coal ash, and therefore less effective at stabilizing floors against damp, and less effective at preserving leather and bone. So seasonal shifts in fuel choice left traces in floor chemistry. Dr. Aaron Allen of the University of Edinburgh, who has studied fuel consumption in Scottish burghs using probate inventories, noted that households in lower closes spent proportionately more on fuel than households on the high street frontages, even though they earned less. And that discrepancy increased after 1750 as coal owners in the Lothians cartelised supply through the Leith coal meters, who set minimum prices. The response was to share hearths and to use communal ovens located in closes such as Bakehouse Close, where a large oven heated by wood was maintained by the incorporation of Baxters and rented to householders for baking and for drying clothes. And the existence of such communal infrastructure explains why some closes preserved fireboxes that are larger than would be required for a single household, and that contain layers of ash that analysis shows came from mixed woods, including pine and birch, rather than from domestic coal. If you crouch beside a communal oven, you sense heat that is not present now, but you see size that implies sharing, and you understand cooperation that documents rarely name. The soundscape of the closes also deserves attention, because it shaped how sealing was experienced, and because sound leaves no direct archaeological trace, yet can be inferred from architecture and from complaints about noise. The close walls are of sandstone that reflects rather than absorbs sound, and the narrow widths between opposing walls, often less than 2 meters, create reverberation that carries voices from one tenement to another, so conversations in a tavern could be heard in lodgings 3 stories above, and arguments in a stairwell could be heard throughout a land. Council minutes contain complaints about scolding and about brawling and about preaching from unauthorised conventicles in closes, and those complaints indicate that privacy was limited and that communal regulation of behaviour depended partly on audibility. After sealing beneath the Royal Exchange platform, sound transmission changed because the platform mass absorbed high frequencies and because sealed rooms were cut off from the street, so early accounts of the vaults described them as unusually quiet compared with open closes, and that quiet contributed to perceptions of desolation that later narratives amplified. Acoustic measurement by researchers from the University of Edinburgh Acoustics and Audio Group in 2017, using impulse responses generated in Mary King's Close and in Southbridge vaults, showed reverberation times of 1.8 to 2.4 seconds in the closed chambers compared with 0.6 seconds in a modern living room, and longer at low frequencies, which makes speech intelligibility lower and which would have forced inhabitants to speak louder and closer, and that condition may have contributed to reported hoarseness among inhabitants noted by Littlejohn in 1865. You stand in a close chamber and clap, and you hear return that is longer than you expect, and you realise how much of daily life would have been audible to neighbours. Begin again with the concept of improvement, because that word recurs in council minutes from the 1750s to the 1870s, and because it carries ideological weight that helps explain why sealing was repeatedly chosen over open redevelopment. Improvement in 18th century Scotland meant more than physical betterment. It meant moral betterment through order and through emulation of English models and through economic rationalisation, and it was promoted by organisations including the Honourable the Society of Improvers in the Knowledge of Agriculture in Scotland founded in 1723, and by writers including Lord Kames, who's historical. Law tracts linked physical environment to civic virtue. George Drummond's letters explicitly invoke improvement as a duty of magistrates and as evidence of Scotland's participation in British modernity after the Union of 1707, and his description of the northern closes as nuisances to be removed rather than as dwellings to be repaired reflects that ideological framing. Robert Kay's proposal for the South Bridge similarly invokes improvement as removal of an obstacle to commerce and to university expansion, and the bridge was justified not only as a crossing but as clearance of the Cowgate curve where vagrants assembled and where waste accumulated. By the 19th century improvement had become sanitary reform and was justified by mortality statistics compiled by Littlejohn and by William Farr in England. Yet its method remains similar, namely demolition and burial of older fabric and construction of wider streets with better ventilation. The archaeological consequence of that recurring ideology is a series of buried horizons, each representing a moment when improvement was enacted through sealing, and each horizon retains the signature of earlier improvement episodes beneath it, so the underground becomes a stratigraphy of improvement ideals as much as of occupation. If you read improvement literature, you notice how often words such as air and light and circulation recur, and you understand those words as both medical and moral. This ideological continuity explains why certain kinds of evidence were not collected at time of sealing, and why archival silences exist where we might expect records. The council minutes record expenditure on new streets in detail, but record little about the people displaced from closes that were sealed, beyond petitions for compensation which were often refused, because from the perspective of improvement, those people were beneficiaries of removal rather than victims of it. Similarly, early town plans by William Edgar in 1765 and by Robert Kirkwood in 1817 show new streets in strong lines and show old closes as faint or omitted. as if cartographic representation itself enacted clearance by emphasizing new order. The antiquarian Robert Chambers collected oral histories that preserved some displaced voices, but he did so 3 generations after the Royal Exchange platform, when many of those voices were already second-hand, and his collection therefore contains family traditions rather than first-hand accounts, which limits its evidential value for mid-18th century experience. That archival silence is not accidental, but structural, produced by institutional priorities that valued mercantile revenue and sanitary improvement over continuity of tenancy, and recognizing that structure helps interpret absence of evidence without filling it with speculation. The absence of articulated skeletons sealed in rooms is therefore not absence of burials elsewhere, because burial registers show increased intramural burial during plague, and because graveyard soils were moved as levelling, but absence of evidence for live immurement within sealed rooms is consistent with archival pattern that documents displacement rather than entombment. You look at a map where a close is omitted, and you understand omission as decision rather than oversight. Consider the materiality of the flagstones that form the close floors, because they reveal local and distant sourcing and labour regimes. Petrographic analysis by geologist Dr. Geoffrey Bolton of the University of Edinburgh identified most close paving as Caithness flagstone and Lothian sandstone transported by coastal shipping to Leith and then carted through the city, and some slabs as imported Pennant sandstone from Bristol Channel, presumably as ballast in ships returning from tobacco trade, which links paving to Atlantic commerce. Where analysis shows concavity on upper surfaces of flagstones that is deepest near doorways and shallow near walls, indicating traffic patterns, and shows secondary recutting of slabs to fit new doorways, indicating reuse, and shows mortar smears on undersides indicating relaying at higher levels to counter damp, which corresponds to documentary references to raising floors. Measurements by surveyors from Edinburgh Archaeology in 2004 recorded flag sizes that vary by phase, with earlier medieval flags being larger and more irregular, and later 18th century flags being smaller and more standardized, reflecting quarrying technology and availability, and that standardization helps date otherwise undiagnostic floor surfaces. The fill above those floors contains fragments of flagstones that were broken during demolition, and whose lithology matches paving below, indicating that some upper floors were smashed in place to form fill rather than removed, which accelerated burial and preserved lower floors by covering them quickly. If you kneel and run your hand over a flag, you feel smoothness in centre and roughness at edge, and you sense feet that wore it. Finally, address the question of ownership and access today, because what is sealed and what is open is determined by modern liability in conservation law as much as by historical chronology. Mary King's Close is owned by the City of Edinburgh Council and leased to a heritage operator under a concession that requires compliance with Historic Environment Scotland's scheduled monument consent procedures. And any intervention requires a written scheme of investigation and monitoring by city archaeologists, and access to sealed reserves is limited to researchers with appropriate insurance, and with approval from both Council and Historic Environment Scotland, so knowledge remains controlled. The South Bridge vaults are in mixed ownership, with some vaults owned by Council, some by private landlords who own shops above, some by the University of Edinburgh, which owns properties along South Bridge, and with access negotiated through individual leases and with safety case requirements including gas monitoring because of methane from organic deposits and carbon dioxide accumulation in unventilated spaces. That mixed ownership reproduces historically the fragmented property pattern of the 18th century, where a close could be owned in vertical layers by different persons, and it means that a comprehensive survey requires consent from multiple parties, which has never been obtained for all vaults simultaneously. Consequently, portions of the underground remain unsurveyed and their contents unknown, not because they are concealed intentionally, but because property law and safety regulation make comprehensive access impractical, and that contemporary sealing through law and liability echoes earlier sealing through masonry and infill. If you ask an archaeologist what remains unrecorded, they will point to a wall, and they will indicate void beyond, and they will explain why entry is not currently feasible, and you will understand that the sealed city is still expanding slightly as knowledge retreats where access cannot be maintained. Add one more frame, because Edinburgh's sealing belongs to a wider British pattern of urban verticality, and because that pattern intensified after the medieval period as timber gave way to stone and as population outpaced walls. In Newcastle, the Lourtburn was culverted and closes built over to form Dean Street, which now spans a buried burn that still flows and that still floods cellars after heavy rain, and whose recording by archaeologists from Tyne and Wear museums mirrors Edinburgh recording in method, namely watching brief during services renewal with collection of ceramics and leather. In Chester, the rows create a two-level street system whose lower level preserves medieval undercrofts that were once open to traffic and that were later enclosed, and whose dating by dendrochronology shows phases that correspond to Edinburgh's mid-17th century subdivision. In Bristol, the Redcliffe Caves were quarried for glass-making sand and then used for storage and then sealed during Civil War defences, and their excavation by Bristol City Museum archaeologists recovered assemblages comparable to Edinburgh's sealed tavern deposits. Yet Edinburgh's preservation remains denser because its crag and tail ridge prevented the kind of lateral expansion that allowed Newcastle and Bristol to overspill, and because its improvement ideology favoured burial over clearance as economical solution, and because its building stone is sandstone that retains surface detail rather than limestone that erodes. So tool marks and whitewash layers survive longer. The comparative work by Dr. Bruce Mann of Historic Environment Scotland, who surveyed subterranean sites across Scottish burghs including Stirling and Perth, concluded that Edinburgh possessed the highest density of preserved close and vault voids per hectare of medieval burgh area, at 4.2 voids per hectare compared with one in Stirling, which quantifies what guides describe anecdotally. If you compare Edinburgh's close density to that of other burghs, you understand how unusual the survival is, and you appreciate why the national record holds so many entries for a small area. Return to the physical act of sealing as labour, because describing it as municipal decision can obscure how many hands were required and how long it took. The Royal Exchange platform required the labour of perhaps 80 men over 2 seasons, according to wage books that record payments to barrowmen and masons and to women who carried mortar in creels. And those men lived in the Canongate and in Potterrow, and were themselves tenants of closes similar to those they were burying, which means builders who sealed closes also experienced close life. The fill they carried was moved by hand and by horse-drawn cart, and calculations by experimental archaeologists who attempted to recreate cartloads using 18th century style barrows suggest that moving the estimated 12,000 cubic metres of rubble required for the platform would have required around 3,000 cart journeys, each of which had to negotiate high street traffic and narrow winds and avoid markets, so the act of burial was itself a substantial urban project that affected city life for months and that generated complaints about dust and noise which appear in council minutes as petitions from merchants whose goods were soiled. The South Bridge Vault infill after abandonment was not a single project but thousands of small decisions by individual owners who blocked entries with stone and mortar to avoid liability, each taking perhaps a day, but cumulatively producing ceiling that was as effective as formal platform despite absence of central direction. That pattern of cumulative small ceilings continues today as owners block service penetrations and as conservation teams install new masonry to stabilize, so the city continues to be sealed in small increments even as other parts are opened for tours. You stand beside a block doorway where mortar is modern and stone is 18th century, and you recognize that sealing is not a past event, but a continuing practice. Consider the archival future of these spaces, because what is preserved now will shape what future researchers can know, and because digital preservation introduces new vulnerabilities. Point clouds stored on servers require migration as formats change, and context sheets stored on acid-free paper require dry storage, and specialist reports stored as PDFs require curation in archaeology data service. And each of those storage methods depends on institutional continuity and funding that is less durable than stone. The 2002 excavation archive for Mary King's Close occupies 4 linear metres of shelving in the council's store at Murrayburn, and includes fines boxes that require climate control to prevent leather decay and metal corrosion. And its digital archive includes over 10,000 photographs whose file formats are already superseded, namely TIFF and early JPEG versions that now require emulation. The decision to preserve in situ rather than excavate wholesale reflects awareness that future methods may recover more information from undisturbed deposits than present methods can, a principle articulated in Historic Environment Scotland's policy statement, Archaeology and Development, which states that preservation in situ should be preferred where significance is high and where methods are likely to improve. That principle means that some chambers intentionally remain sealed and unrecorded beyond exterior laser scan, and those reserves carry forward the logic of burial as conservation, intentionally repeating what George Drummond's builders did unintentionally when they sealed lower rooms beneath rubble and thereby protected them. If you hold an archival box, you feel weight that is different from stone, yet you sense continuity between boxing fines and wall enclosures. There remains the question of why the narrative of a single sealed city, dated 350 years ago, retains power despite contrary evidence, and answering that requires attention to how time is perceived in historic towns where visible fabric is mostly 18th and 19th century, and where earlier fabric is glimpsed only in fragments. A date that places sealing in the mid-17th century places it within living memory of plague, which is a culturally potent association in the aftermath of recent pandemics, and within memory of civil war and covenanting conflict, which gives it political resonance, and within memory of witchcraft prosecution, which gives it moral drama. So the date works narratively even when archaeologically it conflates multiple later sealings. Heritage marketing inevitably selects dates that are memorable and that fit within tour length constraints, and 350 years provides round number that is easy to communicate, whereas a chronology that spans 1645 to. With phases in 1753 to 1761, and 1785 to 1788, and 1867 to 1871, requires longer explanation. Yet the longer explanation offers something more durable than drama, namely insight into how cities manage density through burial, and how that management preserves evidence unintentionally, and how that evidence can be read through careful attention to mortar and ceramic, and parasite over and title deeds. Presenting that longer explanation is therefore not pedantic, but respectful, because it treats audience as capable of holding complexity, and it treats past inhabitants as persons whose labour and displacement merit accurate accounting rather than mythologized entombment. You leave a tour that has told you the longer chronology, and you carry out a sense of cumulative decision rather than single catastrophe, and that sense remains useful when you walk other historic streets. Start with water, because water is the cause of burial and the condition of preservation and the daily burden of the closes, in a way that visitors who see only stone can easily underestimate. Edinburgh's ridge is porous where its sandstones are jointed and impermeable where its igneous intrusions and thick clays intervene. And that heterogeneity creates springs which emerge along predictable horizons, and those springs are mapped in James Craig's plan of Edinburgh 1765, and more accurately in the early geological maps by Robert Jameson of the University of Edinburgh published in 1808. The springs above the Norloch fed tanning pits and breweries and domestic wells, and they also carried waste downslope, because the closes which descended from the high street acted as storm drains in heavy rain, channeling water that had washed over middens into lower rooms and into garderobe pits, which were originally designed to collect feces, but which in practice received mixed waste, including animal bones and broken pottery. The result was a saturated lower stratigraphy in which organic materials such as leather and wood could survive through anaerobic conditions, and in which metals could corrode, and in which the stone itself could remain damp for centuries because its pores remained filled with mineralized water. The Norloch itself was managed by sluices from at least 1570, when the council appointed a keeper to maintain its dam and to ensure water supply to mills at Wells O'Weary and Bonington, and those mills depended on a controlled outfall, so the loch was both defence and power source and cesspool, and its levels fluctuated by more than a metre seasonally. When the loch received heavy rain, water could back up into the lowest closes and flood cellars, and complaints about such flooding appear in the Dean of Guild papers from 1625 onwards, with one petition from 1641 describing the cellar of John Cowie. Merchant has filled to the kist lid, the chest lid with fetid water, and requesting abatement of rent. Archaeologist Ian Stevenson, who examined deposits at Mary King's Close, noted laminated silts interbedded with occupation layers, which he interpreted as flood events, and radiocarbon dating of a wood fragment from one such silt layer returned a date of 1680 plus or minus 40 years, which fits the documentary record of exceptionally wet years in the late 1680s remembered in weather diaries kept by Edinburgh professor John Locke's correspondence. Those flood silts sometimes sealed artefacts beneath sterile layers, which aided preservation because they cut off oxygen and provided a terminus post quem for underlying deposits, which archaeologists use to phase the close stratigraphy more accurately than artifact typology alone would have allowed. If you place your hand on the wall in the lowest part of Mary King's Close, you feel dampness that is not recent leakage from surfaces, but groundwater that has remained present since the platform above was laid, and you realise the building is still negotiating with water. The drainage history of Edinburgh is often narrated as progress from filth to order with James Jardine and William Chadwick, and sanitary reformers as heroes. Yet the physical reality was that improvement created new pathways for water to enter sealed spaces that had previously been flushed only by surface flow. Jardine's proposal to drain the Norloch, presented to the council in 1765 and again in 1811, involved digging a main culvert along the line of the present gardens and subsidiary culverts upslope, and those culverts intercepted spring lines that had previously supplied wells in the closes and diverted them, which dried some upper rooms but increased hydrostatic pressure on the lower walls of the Royal Exchange platform, because water could no longer exit through its previous outfalls. Engineer John Patterson noted in a report to the Dean of Guild in 1824 that water was observed weeping through the masonry of the platform, and that efflorescence, the white crystalline deposit formed by evaporating mineral water, was extensive, and he recommended insertion of weep holes, although whether those holes were inserted is not recorded. And modern observation shows damp patches whose salt content matches historical descriptions. The South Bridge vaults suffered similarly because the bridge deck sheds water through cracks, and because the Cowgate surface slopes toward the bridge piers, producing a constant head of water behind the vault crowns which the original lime mortar could absorb, but which modern cement pointing cannot. So late 20th century conservation repairs sometimes worsened damp by using too hard a mortar. You hear water in the vaults when rain is heavy above, a slow drip that is audible before it is visible, and you are reminded that the ceiling has never been watertight, and that preservation has always depended on a balance that slight changes in surface management could disrupt. Waste disposal practices also dictated what archaeologists find and what they do not, because early modern Edinburgh had a formal economy of waste, which valued certain substances and disregarded others. Dung was valuable as fertiliser, and was collected from stables and sold to farmers in the Lothians, and night soil was also sold, although under increasing regulation after complaints about smell during the day, and the city maintained muck gingers, dung porters, whose guild contested access to collection routes before the council's convener court. Broken pottery and ash and butchered bone had less value, and were more often dumped with enclosures or used as levelling, which explains why midden deposits are dominated by ceramic and animal bone, and why fecal deposits are comparatively rarer in close fills than might be expected given crowding, because the rarer deposits were those most carefully collected for sale. Analysis of animal bone by Dr. Kate Britton of the University of Aberdeen from contexts in Merry King's Close and Blair Street vaults showed high proportions of cattle horn cores and skull fragments, indicating nearby hornworking rather than simply consumption, and high proportions of sheep foot bones indicating fleece processing or catgut manufacture. And both processes produced waste that was tipped downslope, so the dark earth on which the Royal Exchange now rests contains not only night soil, but industrial waste from animal product industries. If you examine the midden under low light, the density of bone fragments is startling, an almost paved surface of cut and split material that testifies to sustained craft rather than casual discard. The ceiling preserved parasite evidence that illuminates health because cesspit deposits sealed beneath floors still contained helminthova, the eggs of intestinal worms including Trichuris trichiura and Ascaris lumbricoids, which survive in anaerobic conditions and which have been identified by Dr. Piers Mitchell of the University of Cambridge, who has studied Scottish urban parasites and who analysed samples taken through column sampling by AOC archaeology. Prevalence rates correspond to overcrowding and to poor hand hygiene and to consumption of undercooked meat, and the samples from Mary King's close contexts show parasite loads comparable to those from contemporary London and higher than those from rural Scottish sites such as Withorn, which suggests urban infection pressure despite the smaller burg size. Similarly, analysis of coprolite samples for starch granules indicated consumption of oats and barley and some rye and the presence of ergot, a fungus that grows on damp grain and that can cause neurological symptoms, which invites reflection on whether some illness attributed to plague or typhus might have had a compounded nutritional and fungal component, although such attribution must remain speculative pending further analysis. Dr. Jenkins of Glasgow University Bioarchaeology Laboratory noted that ergot presence alone does not prove poisoning, yet its presence in sealed contexts provides a new variable for understanding episodes of ill health in closes that were already compromised by damp. You do not need to imagine sickness in these places, because the evidence of its causes remains present as ova and fungal spore and soot in air still particles. The relationship between sealing and preservation of organic materials is therefore not accidental but chemically determined. An understanding that chemistry explains why some parts of the underground are far better preserved than others, and why modern conservation must manage humidity rather than simply exclude water. Leather survives where tannins from bark used in tanning stabilize collagen, and where burial in alkaline ash reduces bacterial attack, and where water excludes oxygen. And conditions of that kind were most common in the lower closes, where ash from hearths was repeatedly dumped over floors to counter damp, and where tanning waste provided tannins, which creates a perverse situation in which poorest sanitation most favoured preservation of items like shoes that would have rotted in cleaner conditions. Wood survives where it was buried rapidly in clay, which prevented insect attack, and metal survives where it was encased in corrosion product that formed a stable skin. And both circumstances occurred where builders laid platform fill of clay and stone directly over rooms without dismantling wooden fixtures. Which is why joist ends survive projecting from walls even though the floors themselves have gone. The Archaeological Conservator at Historic Environment Scotland notes that objects retrieved from sealed contexts require immediate stabilisation because exposure to air triggers rapid decay, and that the best preservation is therefore often continued burial, which is why the policy of resealing after recording is not simply a management convenience, but a conservation necessity. If you watch a conservator unwrap a shoe that has just been excavated, you see it darken and stiffen within minutes, as if the air itself is consuming it. The final aspect of water is the deliberately retained water in the form of wells and cisterns which survived sealing because they were cut into bedrock and could not easily be filled. Mary King's Close contains a wellhead which appears on John Ainsley's map of 1780, and which was documented as still producing water during Royal Exchange construction, and which builders capped rather than infilled, because infilling would have required imported material, and because capping was sufficient to support the platform, so the shaft below the cap remains, and its water contains suspended silt, which preserved a 17th century wooden bucket found in 2003. That bucket, conserved by the Scottish Conservation Studio and now held by City of Edinburgh Council Museum Service, carries rope grooves and iron hoop stains, and its wood species identification as oak indicates use of good timber, even for a utilitarian object, suggesting a household that maintained equipment rather than discarding it. The existence of such wells explains why lower close dwellers persisted long after sanitation had deteriorated, because a constant water source within a property gave it value independent of access or light, and it also explains why later stories about underground rivers and streams arose, because well shafts still carried audible flow when vaults around them were otherwise dry. Start with Edinburgh and end with a pattern that recurs across Britain and beyond, because sealing is not unique to this ridge, although Edinburgh displays it with unusual clarity. Nottingham seals its caves beneath street level, and then reopens them as tanneries, and then seals them again as air raid shelters. And York buries its Roman fortress beneath medieval walls, and then quarries it for stone, and then forgets it until construction for a department store exposes a Principia, and London repeatedly buries its rivers, and then encounters them as impediments to tunnelling. And in each case the underground is not a separate city, but the same city at an earlier moment of accommodation between geology and need and available technology. What Edinburgh offers is density of survival, because its ridge constrained expansion, and because its successive improvements chose burial over clearance for reasons of cost and stability, and because its building stone is durable and its midden chemistry favours preservation, so the evidence of that accommodation remains legible in a way that in many other towns has been destroyed by wholesale redevelopment or by modern piling. The legal history of underground property also widens the frame, because Scots law has long recognised vertical ownership and the concept of a close as a common property with individual ownership of solemn layers. A concept codified in the Tenements Act 2004, but rooted in early modern deeds that described ownership as from heavens to centre of earth, with exceptions for common stairs and cellars. That legal division meant that a vault or a lower close could be owned separately from the rooms above it and could be sold or mortgaged independently, which explains why rate books list different names for different levels of the same street address, and why a council could seal a surface while leaving lower property rights unresolved, creating legal voids that persisted even after physical access was lost. The Register of Sessions, which records property transfers in Scotland, contains entries for dispositions of vaults beneath Southbridge as late as 1892, when the vaults described were already uninhabitable, which indicates that title continued to be traded as speculative asset even after the material asset had decayed. And that paper city persisted alongside the buried one and above it. Research by Professor Adeline Wilson of the University of Strathclyde on Scottish property law and urban subdivision shows that such vertical disintegration was characteristic of Edinburgh more than Glasgow, because Edinburgh's rigid burgage pattern prevented lateral expansion, so complexity grew vertically and legally rather than geographically. If you follow a title in the register, you move from Edinburgh to Leith to writing chambers in Parliament Square and back again, carrying a piece of the vault with you on paper. The comparative anthropology of underground dwelling also helps situate Edinburgh's experience, because human beings have inhabited caves and excavated complexes for millennia, and have often associated depth with both danger and sanctity. And Edinburgh's vaults attract contemporary theories about innate fear of dark enclosed spaces that draw on environmental psychology yet the historical record suggests that inhabitants did not experience their lodgings as terrifying, but as economic and social facts conditioned by rent and by guild membership and by fuel price. The excavation of Gilmerton Cove, a complex of rock-cut chambers south of the city whose origins are contested, and whose tool marks indicate both pick and later drill, shows deliberate creation of subterranean space for reasons that remain debated among specialists from the University of Edinburgh and Edinburgh Archaeological Field Society, with interpretations ranging from Covenanters' Refuge to 18th century forge to folklore meeting place, and with dating evidence including a table and hearth and a supposed drinking trough. Yet even there the construction implies choice and management rather than desperation. The vaults beneath the Royal Mile were not mines or refuges, but housing produced through relentless subdivision and maintained through whitewash and through repeated relaying of floors to stay above damp. And their abandonment was slow and without catastrophe, except for those whose health failed in them. You enter a vault that has been whitewashed 7 times, and you understand that repetition as a form of care, an attempt to keep a place habitable by people who had few alternatives. Now allow the frame to widen one step further toward the relationship between living and dead, and between present ground and past work, because burial in Edinburgh is not only architectural, but corporeal, and because churchyards and midden are entangled in ways that modern separation of waste and dead tends to obscure. Greyfriars Kirkyard contains walls rebuilt from gravestones, and contains bodies whose graveyard soil was later carted as levelling into closes, which means a sherd from a close infill might contain within its adhering soil a trace element derived from human bone. And osteologist Dr. Angela Boyle, who analysed disarticulated bone from Mary King's clothes, noted that archival burial records and isotope analysis sometimes align to suggest origins in the kirkyard rather than in situ death, which again disrupts simple narratives of sealing with corpses inside. The town council's management of both waste and burial through the same contractors and through the same carts and through adjacent dumping grounds means that categories which feel distinct to modern thought were physically mixed, and that mixing is now part of the archaeological record, which requires a method that can distinguish pathogendina in cess from pathogendina in burial soil, and that must acknowledge where that distinction cannot be made. The interdisciplinary project led by Dr. John Clark of the University of Edinburgh's Medical Humanities Initiative has attempted to bring bacterial ADNA and parasite analysis together to understand typhus and relapsing fever in the closes, and its preliminary results suggest recurrent louse-borne disease rather than rat-borne plague as the more constant companion of the lower closes after 1700. If you stand in Greyfriars at dusk and look toward the city chambers, you sense how short the distance is between kirkyard and close, a matter of a few hundred metres and a few decades of cart traffic. That sense of short distance is perhaps the deepest frame this underground provides, because it collapses time in a way that maps and timelines alone cannot. The masonry that supports Briggs arches incorporates stone quarried by men who also attended the hanging of Burke in 1829, and the mortar contains lime burned in kilns that also supplied lime for infirmary construction, where Robert Knox lectured. And the shoes preserved contain leather from cattle slaughtered in the Cowgate shambles, whose horns were worked 2 closes away. And that compact chain of embodied labour is present simultaneously in a single chamber. The medieval tenement wall, which was truncated to form a foundation for an 18th century exchange, now supports a 21st century museum display, and the visitor who watches the display stands on fill that contains the demolished upper stories of the house whose lower rooms they are viewing. So the act of looking is itself situated on the material that makes looking possible. Edinburgh compresses these chains because its ridge forces them to occupy the same vertical space, and yet similar chains exist beneath any city that has persisted for centuries, although they are less visible because they are more dispersed. If you close your eyes in the vault, you hear traffic above and water below and your own breath between, and for a moment those sounds have the same material presence as stone. Then the closing descends to something slower, because what remains after explanation is not puzzle, but scale. The closes beneath the Royal Exchange were last fully open to daylight in the 1750s, which is within genealogical memory if you count 10 generations, and were last occupied in the early 19th century within the memory of photographs, and were rediscovered in the late 20th century within living memory of many residents of Edinburgh who remember playing in ruined closes behind the high street before conservation boards excluded access. And that brevity of interval between burial and recognition is itself significant, because it shows how rapidly a city can forget a portion of itself when economic and sanitary logic demands forgetting, and how rapidly it can remember when tourism and heritage economics provide incentive. The deeper burial of early medieval deposits beneath the closes belongs to a timescale that is not genealogical but archaeological, perhaps 700 years, and the geological foundation beneath all of that belongs to a timescale that is profound, 340 million years for the dolerite plug and 15,000 for the shaped ridge. And the human occupation occupies the smallest fraction of that span, and yet has altered the ridge more radically than ice did, by cutting and tunnelling and filling and sealing until the ridge itself carries within it the memory of its own densification. That layering is not unique to Edinburgh, but Edinburgh makes it visible. And that visibility is what gives Merry King's Close and the South Bridge vaults their continuing value beyond any particular story told within them, because they show the city as accretion rather than as plan. You leave by the same stair you entered, ascending into cooler, fresher air and into the noise of the high street which is present before you see it, and the ground under your feet changes from worn flag to modern stone without marking the boundary where the buried platform begins. The final sensation is that of weight remembered. Above you lies the weight of Parliament and law courts and mercantile exchange, and of tourists and trams, and of a university whose library holds maps of the closes, and whose laboratories analyse parasite ova from their floors. And below you lies the weight of stone that was quarried and carted and mortared, and then infilled, and then forgotten, and then remembered again. And between those weights lies the narrow interval that was once living space, and remains so in the sense that material traces of living persist and continue to affect management and interpretation. The city sealed beneath Edinburgh is not a lost Atlantis and not a plague tomb, but a habitual outcome of a medieval burg that grew too dense for its topography, and that solved its density first by building higher and then by building over what could no longer be maintained. And that solution is still present because stone endures, and because ash and clay preserved what document and memory did not, and because a few men with a sledgehammer in 1985 chose to see whether a damp wall in a pub cellar marked a void and found behind it the persistence of that older decision, and the void once found could not be fully resealed in the civic imagination even when it was resealed in stone, and now it remains open long enough for you to enter and to stand where Isabel Stewart once petitioned for repair, and where Alexander King stored cloth before dying in fever, and where a shoemaker stamped his name into a boot heel that outlasted both the house he lived in and the guild that regulated him, and to feel beneath your feet the compacted dark earth that is itself a city composed of 7 centuries of burning and making and discarding and levelling, and to understand that beneath every historic street there lies such compaction waiting under thin surfaces for a chance change in ownership or economy or curiosity to be exposed again, and that what is beneath Edinburgh is therefore not an anomaly but a condition made visible for a time,